Robert Monckton and the Battle for North America. When painter Benjamin West unveiled his full-length portrait of British Major General Robert Monckton at a London exhibition in 1764, he painted the image of an empire builder, a confident officer in a gleaming uniform, his arm outstretched in a classical pose of victory, as smoke rises from a captured fortress behind him. It is a triumphant message, one that befits the British sense of superiority in the 18th century, until one looks closely into Monckton's eyes. Here we find a man of unexpected timidity, almost an uncertainty. The question therefore becomes, who is the true Robert Monckton? Which is the more accurate portrayal of the British general? Was he truly the man of arrogant posture or the man of tentative eyes? Or was he both? To help decide, I would like to tell you about a few key moments in Monckton's military career as the British and the French fought for control of North America in the mid-18th century. The first moment involves a group known as the Acadians. The Acadians were French settlers living in what is now called Nova Scotia. The Acadians first arrived in this part of Canada in 1604, and they built a society that was unlike almost anything else in the colonial world. In fact, freed from the close attention of France, the Acadians developed a strikingly independent society. Catholics and Huguenots coexisted in peace as they diked marshlands to create fertile fields. They also built lasting cooperative relationships with the indigenous Mi'kmaq people, relationships that were rooted in mutual respect, shared resources, and widespread intermarriage. In some ways, the Acadians realized what the famous French explorer Samuel Champlain dreamed of when he wrote that the French and the indigenous tribes might become one people. The Acadians' unique society both puzzled and irritated their British neighbors to the south. As one man complained in 1731, the Acadians have no taxes to pay, and they trade little but amongst themselves, everyone raising for himself what he wants. To the mercantilist oriented British colonists to the south, this self sufficient communal life was so incomprehensible it was actually threatening. And this threat was more than cultural, it was also geopolitical. By the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the treaty which ended the War of Spanish Succession, Acadia became a British territory. The Acadians who remained in the region were promised the right to practice Catholicism and to keep ownership of their lands. But two explosive questions were never resolved. Where exactly were the borders of Nova Scotia? And did the Acadians have to take a loyalty oath to the British Crown or not? The Acadians repeatedly refused to take an oath, not out of disloyalty to Britain, so much as the recognition that their survival depended on their continued neutrality. They promised to stay out of any war between Britain and France, and for decades this uneasy arrangement held. But by 1750, the ground was shifting beneath the Acadians' feet, as both the British and the French built new forts along the Mississauga River, and the Acadians found themselves caught between two colonial powers fighting for control of a continent. Robert Monckton arrived in this charged landscape in 1752, taking command of Fort Lawrence on the British side of the Mississauga River, over a mile from France's Fort Beauséjour. For 3 years, he managed the daily tensions of the frontier while watching the political temperature rise around him. By the spring of 1755, with open conflict erupting between the French and the British in the Ohio Valley, Nova Scotia's Governor Lawrence decided that the time had come to act. He ordered Monckton to seize Fort Beauséjour with the help of 2,000 Massachusetts provincial soldiers. On June 2nd, 1755, 34 British vessels full of reinforcements sailed into the Bow Basin harbor, Just 2 weeks later, Monckton had secured Fort Beauséjour and its surrender. The terms of the surrender had a calculated ambiguity that would seal the Acadians' fate. When the French commander asked that the Acadians who had taken up arms be protected from harm, Monckton's reply had said that only that they would be forgiven. He did not promise safety. He did not promise the right to worship. He chose his words with the precision of a man who knew what was coming: the planned expulsion of the Acadians from eastern Canada. Governor Lawrence had ordered Monckton to begin the expulsion of the Acadians near Fort Beauséjour. These were the people who had taken up arms against the British Crown and who, therefore, were entitled to no favor. The strategy Monckton employed was one of deliberate deception. He invited Acadian men to the former French fort to discuss the arrangements concerning the return of their lands. About 400 men arrived. Once inside the fort, the gates were closed behind them, and these Acadian men were told that their lands had been confiscated and that they were now prisoners of the British Crown. This technique was repeated in other communities where men were invited to meetings in churches. The Acadians protested that they had come in good faith and that what the British were doing was unchristian and immoral. But Monckton didn't budge. He replied that the Acadians would remain prisoners until transport ships were ready to take them to other British colonies, and that if their families did not submit as well, the men would be shipped off without their wives and children. What came next was a scorched earth campaign. Governor Lawrence ordered villages burned, crops destroyed, and all boats and canoes seized, leaving those Acadians who fled into the woods with no viable means of survival through the coming winter. Women and children were then loaded onto ships regardless of whether their husbands were aboard or not. The conditions on the transport ships were horrific. 300 people were confined into a space about 24 feet wide, 48 feet long, and 15 feet high, with no plumbing, no heat, and almost no ventilation. 14% of those who were transported did not survive the journey, and that is a death rate that parallels that of the enslaved Africans during the Middle Passage. In the fall of 1755, an estimated 11,000 Acadians were uprooted and distributed across British colonies that had little interest in receiving them. Those in Georgia and South Carolina were accused of destabilizing the colonial order. Those under 21 in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania were separated from their parents and made indentured servants. Those who arrived in Virginia were refused entry altogether and shipped off to England, where they were held as prisoners for 8 years. Other Acadians fled to Quebec, which was controlled by France, or took refuge with the Mi'kmaq. Eventually, the Acadians' diaspora brought many of them to the swamps of Louisiana, where they again established a community far from outside influences. Thanks to this isolation, they slowly developed an identity that was separate from that of France or Canada or the United States. They gradually developed their own distinctive culture. They became known as Cajuns. Today, Cajun culture can be seen in language and food and music. And today, thanks to the removal of the Acadians, Nova Scotia is an English-speaking province of Canada. The second important moment in the military career of Robert Monckton, as the French and the British battled for control of North America, came in 1759, when the British attempted to capture Quebec. Quebec was the capital of the French North America and is one of the most naturally fortified cities in the world. The city sits on a bluff rising 350 feet above the St. Lawrence River. The promontory forces the river into a narrow channel, creating currents that are difficult to navigate, and the rock formation itself is accompanied by a long, sharp escarpment. This creates a natural wall of protection for the city. Then, to the northeast of the city, along the Beauport shore, there were tidal mud flats that made moving men and equipment difficult. The city also had man-made fortified walls that offered protection. The French commander of Quebec, General Montcalm, understood the city's geography perfectly. As long as the natural defenses held, Quebec was nearly impregnable. In June 1759, however, the British attempted to take the city anyway, and they sailed up the St. Lawrence River. They landed troops on three shorelines: Beauport, the island of Orleans, and at Port Levé. The British spent the rest of the summer shelling Quebec, but they were unable to dislodge the French. James Wolfe was the primary British commander, and Monckton was the second in command. But when Wolfe fell ill in August with dysentery, he relinquished command to Monckton. Monckton and the other brigadier generals were the ones who decided that the only way to break the stalemate was to attempt a landing west of the city. This would cut Quebec off from the lifeline of supplies that were coming from Montreal, and the place that was chosen for the landing was called Follon, a place where a break in the escarpment allowed access to the fertile fields above the river, known as the Plains of Abraham. The British attempt to capture Quebec began on the night of September 12th and 13th. British light infantry troops proved able to land undetected, and then they scaled the 175-foot gully in darkness. By dawn on September 13th, over 4,000 British troops stood in formation on the Plains of Abraham, their faces turned towards Quebec. The French commander, Montcalm, found himself in a difficult position that morning. If he waited for all his troops to assemble, the British would have more time to land more troops of their own. If Montcalm retreated behind the city's walls, he worried that there was every possibility that the walls were not strong enough to withstand a British siege. And so, in his mind, it became clear that he must attack immediately. Therefore, Montcalm ordered his men out of the city of Quebec and on to the Plains of Abraham. Once in formation, they began advancing towards the British line at 10 a.m. The photograph on the left is the place where the French line began its final advance. The British line is where the traffic light is, near the yellow building. The British are very far away. The French troops advanced and ended up firing their opening volley much too far from the British front line, given the accuracy of mid-18th century weapons. Wolfe, on the other hand, had ordered his men not to fire until the French were within 40 yards, which is about the distance from where the photograph on the right is taken to the traffic light in the yellow house. When the moment came, the British lines erupted in a near simultaneous volley that was so loud, witnesses described it sounding like cannon fire. The French advance collapsed. A second volley finished it, and the French troops, many of whom were not battle-tested, fled in retreat. The Battle for North America had lasted 15 minutes. Both Wolfe and Montcalm fell in battle that morning. Wolfe died on the Plains of Abraham, bleeding from 3 musket wounds, but knowing of British victory. This is a famous and idealized painting of the moment, which was also painted by Benjamin West. Wolfe was 32. Montcalm was struck by a bullet during the retreat and died the following morning within the city's walls. He was 47. Monckton also was injured during the battle. He took a musket through his chest just as the French troops were giving way. Amazingly, he survived the operation to remove the bullet, and he lived another 23 years. Quebec formally surrendered on September 18, 1759. The capital of French North America was British. The third and final notable moment in Monckton's military career came in 1762, when he successfully captured the French Caribbean island of Martinique. This kidney-shaped island was one of the key centers of French sugar cane production. The island was so important economically that the British had attempted to take it in 1759, but had failed to do so because they did not account for the island's topography. Monckton was chosen to lead the second attempt because he was the British officer with the most experience in the British Army of managing amphibious invasions. The lush island is 43 miles long and 19 miles wide. It is dominated by a 4,500-foot volcano known as Mount Pelée. And unlike many Caribbean islands, Martinique is blessed with both rich soil and ample water. Monckton's plan required the concentration of almost twice as many troops as were involved in the 1759 attempt, and this meant pooling troops from North America, Britain, Europe, and other islands in the Caribbean. All told, more than 20 ships would gather, and they would carry over 13,000 troops, 1,000 white volunteers, and a significant number of conscripted black slaves. Monckton decided to attack the island in several different places at once to keep the French off guard, but the main attack was to be just north of the capital, Point Royal, which is labeled here with a blue star. The huge fleet bombarded the beach defenses north of Point Royal into oblivion, and Monckton was easily able to establish a beachhead at sunset on January 16th. The rest of the army disembarked at sunrise the following day. The month-long assault of the capital required the capture of a series of 3 forts on the mountains above Port Royal. For as one soldier recorded in his journal, whoever is master of these hills commands the fort. Monckton's troops successfully rose to this challenge, and the French governor surrendered on February 15, 1762. Martinique became a British possession. Military history both fascinates and frustrates because of its unique ability to change political circumstances, economic patterns, and social conditions with astonishing and capricious speed. One amended order, one wind shift, one bullet's trajectory can make the difference between catastrophe and triumph, permanence and ephemerality. Monckton seems to have appreciated this character of war, for he understood how much hung in the balance of each and every decision in the military campaign. He also realized that despite all of his careful planning, all could be undone with the capriciousness of uncertainty. This means that I see Benjamin West doing a wonderful job capturing Monckton's view of the world in this portrait. Thank you.